All right, everybody, we're going to get started here. This is session 3 of Fundamentals of Biblical Counseling, and we're going to be jumping into a deeper look at those 8 elements of counseling that we reviewed last week, and we're going to take the whole period and talk about inventory. Again, our purpose, what we're trying to do is set you up so that you are able to have a system set before you that makes sense when you're meeting with people. You know, what does counseling look like? In fact, yesterday the interns and I were talking about what the first session looks like, and I was going into that, taking a deeper dive on that, but. What I'd like to give you today is just the whole data gathering. Inventory is data gathering. It's finding out about the person. So, for example, what we're going to be doing here really is learning how to exegete people. What does that mean? Right? What does it mean to exegete people? What does it mean to exegete Scripture? Right, to draw the meaning out of the Scripture. And counseling, we draw meaning out of the Scripture. We also draw meaning out of people. In other words, we want to enter their world and find out what their world is like. We want to be able to give an answer based on knowledge, based on understanding of who they are. And that's compassionate counseling, by the way. Have you ever been to a doctor and you're trying to explain what's going on, but they don't listen? Yep. Yeah, isn't that frustrating? Yeah, we don't want to do that in biblical counseling. And in some ways, you know, we have to take our time with this. So what are we talking about? The overall... If I were to summarize the 8 into 3, the 8 elements into 3 elements, I would summarize them into these 3 main areas. If you can memorize these 3, I'm not telling you to do that for a test, I'm just for real life. In the counseling process, inventory, the data gathering, diagnostics, or interpreting the data, and instruction, that's the actual application or the counsel that we give. If you can memorize these 3, these are the main 3 of the whole process. Now, this may look familiar to you because this is exactly how we approach the Scriptures. This is how this is a Bible study method, actually, that comes from Dr. Howard Hendricks' book, Living by the Book. So that may, if you've read or you're familiar with that, you maybe recognize some of the terminology, especially the ones in the yellow parentheses. In order to really understand the Scriptures, we have to study them correctly. Now we can't. You said you were doing your quiet time this morning, right? Now, you didn't start with the application, right? No, you looked at the passage, you thought about it, maybe some people actually get their BI notes out and, they really get into it. But before you made the application, you wanted to understand what the passage said, and obviously you made some observations before you made the application. So we observed the text, what's going on in the text, what's going on in the lives of the people, who it was written to, why it was written, all of those things. Then we begin to, it was written to a group of people who were dealing with sexual idolatry. I'm thinking of Corinthians. And I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians 6. And then 2 Corinthians 5. You know, the passage there where that guy was really involved in some really hideous sexual sin. And in order to understand the application of that, we need to understand what was going on at the time, what Paul was dealing with, why he was dealing with. Okay, so that brings us into the interpretation. What does this mean? What does this mean? the guy was involved in so much, and the church wasn't doing anything about it. And so Paul called them to take severe action against this person. Now, what is the application for us? What is the application for us? I mean, simply, my little brief exegesis of that, what would be an application of that? Right, well, yeah, specifically, what would be an example of an application of 1 Corinthians 6 and 2 Corinthians 5? What would be a simple application based on our little exegesis? How would you apply what I just said to your life or to life in general?
Avoid sexual sin.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a start, right. But not only avoid it, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? You need to take it seriously. Okay. And if somebody is refusing to respond, I don't know if you remember that passage more clearly, you were to take severe action. You weren't even to associate with somebody who claimed to be a believer and yet lived in open, gross sin. There's the application. Now, we do the same thing in a counseling situation. We observe the person. That's the inventory. That's what we're going to be talking about today. We want to know what's going on in their life. We want to know their history, just like you want to know the historical background of a book, kind of the 10,000-foot view, as well as the, in-your-face kind of view, close and personal, inventory-wise. We want to know what their life is like, what their situations are like, the temptations, their relationships, the people in their life, the kinds of things that they face, the depth of their suffering, all of that. Then we can diagnose what's going on. Now, diagnostics is while it's critically important, it's something that we have to be very careful of, because we're talking about heart issues. And then we can give the instruction. So, let's talk a little bit more about inventory. What does inventory look like? What we're doing in the life of a counselee is we're trying to acquire information in order to gain, key word here, understanding into what's going on in a person's life. We want to understand what's going on in a person's life. Now, I'm going to. This may seem just rhetorical, but I'm asking a specific question. What does it mean to understand? What does it truly mean to understand?
With what somebody's going through, or
just in general. What does understanding mean? I don't want to jump past this because I think that's a really key element to data gathering.
Proverbs always puts understanding with knowledge and wisdom. So the understanding, so you know what particular thing they're going through, or you sympathize with that, and you have the knowledge of how to deal and the wisdom to go about with it.
Okay? Anyone else? Yeah.
Do you know the nature and significance of whatever the thing is?
Okay. Mm-hmm. The nature and the significance. That's good. Two good connection words there. Here's the thing. Good communication, right, requires understanding between two people. And what that means is that you're able to communicate in such a way where you're reaching understanding in the counseling. You're reaching, here's another way of saying understanding in counseling, common meaning. Not that you agree with everything they say, but you understand what they're saying. And they understand what you're saying. In other words, as you're gathering inventory, they're going to use words. You guys are talking about anxiety. right before class. Obviously that's a counseling issue, right? And you guys are using different terms and whatnot. Now, and that's great, by the way, but here's the thing. Not everybody may understand all the terms you used. You as a counselor may define a word. You may understand anxiety different than the counselee understands anxiety. The nature of anxiety, I like that word. The nature, or even the definition of it. So in counseling, when you're gathering data, when you're having this conversation, the goal is for you guys, one-on-one, to at least agree and have common meaning in the terminology and in your conversation. So part of data gathering is just defining terms. So some of the questions that you ask is clarifying, what do like, if we were to get together and talk about anxiety, I would ask questions, please describe what that's like for you. How does that impact your life? What are the challenges that brings to your life? When is it the most intense? What's helped? What's not helped? I want to understand that struggle in a person's life, whatever the issue might be. But I also want to make sure that we understand the same thing. That now, if the person that we're talking to maybe has a different concept, maybe it's not even an accurate concept. It's not that we go right ahead and correct it. But we have to at some point come to an agreement. And the best way to do that is to understand how that plays in a person's life. See, that's compassion. And again, everybody has access to information. And so we define, we go to WebMD. I mean, that's a place a lot of people go and, find out about something. I mean, that can be a very useful, helpful resource. But again, the key is to have understanding. That, by the way, folks, is a general principle of good communication. Is when each person reaches common meaning, understanding. Do you know why there's problems in marriages? They say, well, yeah, one of the number one problems is communication. You know why? You know where the communication breaks down? Is in understanding. Does that all make sense? All right, I just needed to emphasize that as we consider that. Now, there's a bunch of statements about what inventory involves here. The main idea goes back to what we were talking about the other day, asking questions. A good counselor becomes skilled at asking good questions. Learn how to ask good questions. We said last week that a question stirs the conscience, an accusation hardens the will. Obviously, when we're interacting with people, we don't want to put people on the defense. And we don't want to interrogate them either, by the way. So that's why it becomes a skill. But we want to ask questions in order to understand what's going on in their life and how it impacts their life. So these are some guidelines for asking questions, good questions. Make sure they're specific, concrete, relevant questions that are looking for facts. And I can put it this way. The questions primarily ought to be, the five. Who, what, where, when, how often. Who, what, where, when, how often. Those are the kinds of questions you want to ask. Well, we're gonna get into that even deeper to show you what that looks like. What we're looking for and what we're thinking about, where are we heading with this? Again, remember, we're heading towards an understanding. But one of the things that we want to understand is we want to uncover the thought processes below the surface. So, somebody struggling with various aspects, of life. Maybe someone's struggling with depression. I want to ask questions that help me understand how they think through their depression, what they think about depression, how they define depression, what they believe is the nature of depression, where they believe their depression comes from, what they believe they can do or not do about their depression. Now, again, none of this is, I'm not looking for right or wrong, say, aha, I caught you. Now we need to correct that. That's not where we're going. But are they seeing things, however, from a biblical perspective? Now, do we correct that right away? No, we're just, again, trying to get that overall picture of how they think. How do they process their suffering, their difficulty, whatever it is they might be facing? As we ask questions, we want to consider the appropriate context, timing, all of that, and that all depends on the relationship. Some people you can be direct because you have that relationship. They're not going to misunderstand that. Other people, you have to find ways to ask the question to draw it out. Have a good reason for asking any question. Okay, you're not, when you're asking questions, you're now probing into the depths of a person's heart. Don't let curiosity drive your questions. Just mere curiosity. Have a good reason. Space the question so a person doesn't feel like under pressure. What about this? What about that? What about this? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? Whatever. Sometimes, now some people have observed in my counseling, there are spaces in between my questions, and I don't say anything. Now, sometimes people don't know what to do with that, but then I think most counselees appreciate that. I find out later. They may not understand it at first, because I want the thought processes. I want somebody to give a person a chance to think questions through, and I don't want them to feel interrogated. Do not answer the question yourself. Married couples may do that, and that's probably okay sometimes, but don't answer the question. Ask the question and give the answer. Or ask the question in a way that you're giving the answer. You want them to answer it. Because here's the thing. It's just like here when I throw out a question and say, well, what do you think this? Anytime we're in a public, we're thinking, okay, he's looking for what's the right answer. What's the right answer that I must give? And we're not looking for a right answer. We're just looking for, again, how are they processing things? No worries. Glad you're here. So don't answer the question yourself. And then here's another thing. Withhold judgment. We're not there to judge anybody. We're fellow sinners. We got our issues. We're not there, and especially when you're probing into, the heart issues. Those are the motivation issues. And here's what I mean by judging. In one sense, we are judging. We have to judge. Because the idea, what I'm saying is in the context of discernment. Okay? We have to be able to recognize good and evil, right and wrong, wisdom and foolishness. That requires judgment. But the way we sometimes use judgment is we are coming to a conclusion of what the motive is. We need to judge behavior. We need to judge statements that are made in light of the Word, in light of the Scripture, ultimately. But we have to be very careful that we don't apply motive to that especially early on as we're gathering data. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying? That you know the difference? So the idea of judging is actually biblical, but not the worldly judgment of how we judge each other's motives. And we pass condemnation. You know, that's sinful judgment. So there's a difference there. In other words, it's like what Matthew 7 says. It says, judge not lest you be judged. What he's talking about there, Jesus is talking about there, is judging people to the same standard. You know, we judge other people's sins much harsher than we do our own. That's the warning there. Now, when you're dealing with people, especially when you deal with people more and more on a regular basis, and as you're involved more and more in formal counseling, or I'll tell you what, informal counseling, somebody confides in you because you're a peer, you're a friend, and they confide in something that's hard. Or here's one, it doesn't fit the culture where we're in. I think this happens all the time in the BI culture. Because there's kind of a false sense of high spirituality, right? And sometimes, I don't know about you, have you ever felt like you don't belong in that? Because I think there's a good number of students who come here, depending maybe on their background or whatever, and they come here and there's and I don't think it's bad, but there's a high sense of spirituality. There's a positive element of everybody is doing fine. You have to do fine. You have to be walking with the Lord in happiness and joy all the time. And if you're not, there's something wrong with you. And there's all kinds of little sound bites that we use. And sometimes people are very sincere about it, so I don't want to. But if you come from a situation, or you're struggling with some gross sin, you don't want to be open about that. You know, what will people think of me, a BI student, struggling with this sin? I'm not telling anybody. I'm not talking to anybody. So people hang on to that because they fear that somehow somebody's going to judge them. And we gotta get away from that. The fact of the matter is, what makes your sin worse than my sin, or vice versa? You know, especially the topics that are cultural battlefields. Same-sex attraction. That's an area where I think people have a hard time opening up about because of the cultural battles that surround that. What will you think of me? And the fact of the matter is, I know a lot of sincere, God-loving believers that struggle in that area, and they don't understand what's going on, and they hide it. They're afraid to share because of what the biblical community might think of them. And so we have to create kind of an atmosphere where it's okay. Don't judge somebody. Back a few years ago, Mark Strout and I were developing just a philosophy of student life when I worked in student life, and we came up with the term a culture of grace. You know, the idea in a biblical community like this or in our local churches is we ought to have a culture of grace where it's really easy to just say, man, I'm really struggling with something. I know it's wrong. I know it's bad. I need help. Where a person feels like they're not going to, be kind of looked down upon. Oh, that's sin. Believers shouldn't struggle with that. And in biblical counseling relationship, that's sometimes a huge, it seems like an insurmountable wall of what prevents somebody from opening up. So again, I didn't mean to park on that for so long, but really that's That's something that we really need to work on. And I know I got to be aware of that because even a generational thing. Because there's preconceived ideas of what I might think of them because I'm older, all of that kind of stuff. You know, your generation is different than ours, and da-da-da-da-da, and, you know, he's really going to be upset if I, you know, or what's he really going to think of me? Or based on position, all of that kind of thing. And that's why we define biblical counseling, by the way, as one broken person sharing with another broken person. So don't let that affect your data gathering. Okay, observe their countenance. That's important data as well. Observe their countenance. What is countenance?
That's their standard.
Yeah. The things that countenance is the stuff that surrounds them. Body language, the way they sit in a, you know, in the chair next to you, maybe. Don't overinterpret it, but observe it and ask questions of things you might observe that, you know. When I was a pastor, I was meeting with a guy, and this might have been just my naivety, but he's sitting there, bloodshot eyes, really disheveled. It's like our second meeting, and I noticed that, so I said, "Did you have a hard time sleeping last night?" And he turned around and looked at me and said, "No, I'm drunk." And he was, and didn't even see it. I'm glad I asked the question because it did change the direction of the counseling that morning. But observe, that's an extreme example, but observe the countenance. You know, people, but don't overinterpret it. You know, cross-cultural counseling, I learned a lot. You know, I remember counseling a dear Korean brother, and he wouldn't look at me. And now in American culture, what does American culture teach us about the fact when people don't look at you when they talk?
Disrespect.
Yeah, right? Didn't your parents tell you that? Yeah. In Korean culture, it's a complete opposite. Complete opposites. So don't overinterpret or misinterpret some of that data, but it is important to watch. You might see an extreme change in countenance from meeting to meeting. And again, that may be a good thing. How's your week been? Oh, it's been fantastic. Okay, yeah, it's kind of showing in your countenance. You seem like a different person. Tell me about it. All right, then there is mark important areas for further questioning. So when I do counseling formally, I have a notepad. I do. Now, why do I have a notepad? So I don't forget things. And I don't write everything they're saying. I write the things that I want to make sure I remember. There's two reasons why I want to remember. One is because it's part of the whole story. And the other thing I want to remember is things that I may need to go back to get a better understanding, but I don't want to interrupt their conversation. And that's what we mean here. What areas may need further questioning? So I'm going to write that down. And for me, you know, when I have a pad, here's I'll write in this corner here further questions. You know, that way I can kind of come back around and ask some other questions. Because that might be important data. Now, sometimes what happens is they might answer it eventually, so I, you know, cross it off. But it's very frustrating, when you think, yeah, I got to come back and ask that question. And if I don't write it down, then what was that question I wanted to ask them? Then that can be actually distracting because you're trying to remember that question and listen to them at the same time. Now, the question is, do you take notes when it's a little bit less formal? I think the less formal it is, probably I don't, I'm not really necessarily taking notes that way. However, if the issue starts out informal and it's a serious issue, yeah, I'm gonna probably want to jot some things down. All right. Now, having said that, during the first session, and by the way, any counseling session, formal or informal, this is what we call core data, these 3 key questions. You can memorize this and at least be ready to have to start a counseling session and have some focus in what you're talking about. Counseling can go all over the place. A counselee can take a conversation in all kinds of directions. And then at the end of the day, you just didn't get anywhere. So these 3 questions at least give you some goals in how to keep the session going in the right direction. This is key data that you at least want to walk away from in the first session. And again, I'm talking about all kinds of techniques about asking questions and yada, 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 yada. However, if you forget all of that and can remember these 3 things, the next time you talk to somebody, the next time you give somebody advice, you're going to have a good paradigm to stay focused. Okay? What do you see as the problem? What is the issue? What is the problem? And again, do you understand what the problem is? Have you reached common meaning with them? What is the problem? Then, what have they done about it? How have they responded? How have they treated it? How have they addressed it? That's what we're talking about. And then, what do you want me, how can I as a counselor help you? In other words, what do they want the counselor to do? Now, the first one is obvious. What's the problem? Why do I need to know this next thing? What have they done about it?
It could show you what they've done in the past and what hasn't worked, and maybe what has worked. And it also keeps you from needlessly repeating what's already been done.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I think it opens up more about their past. And so it allows you to understand them a little bit better, kind of what Rebecca was saying. Things not to repeat, things you can do, but I think it's just more further understanding your counselee.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think about it as the person, like when I says, what have you done about it, is I can see if that person actually wants the change, because a lot of people mention they want the change and they don't do anything about it. They're just like, oh yeah, I just want to fix it. And they're just like, okay, what have you done?
Good. Yeah, that's good. Good insight. Yeah, that's another element. It could reveal a little bit of what is their level of commitment to change. Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or it can also reveal things like, Rebecca, you were talking about what they've already done. And did they make it worse? Or they were doing things, but they gave up. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's an important That's an important thing. And then why do we need to know what they want the counselor to do? What might that reveal?
Might show their true heart and intentions behind why they might be there.
Okay?
I think it can reveal the way that the other person expects you to behave or help them out.
Okay? I follow. Yep. Yep. Yeah, it might, a lot of times, this tells you what their agenda for you is. And that's important because sometimes they set the goal, that becomes the goal of the counseling for them. That's how they evaluate whether your counsel was successful or not. That may not be accurate and they may not be very fair because they could have the wrong expectation. I'm going to give you an example in a counseling situation. This is a marriage counseling one, but it'll fit, and you'll probably hear this at some point anyway too. What do you think of this? So guy comes to me, he says, Pastor Joe, I need you to help me, with my marriage. Okay, so we kind of go through this. What's the problem with your marriage? What's going on? My wife is about ready to leave me. I'm gonna, and in fact, I want her back. Well, what have you done about it? Well, I've seen other counselors because I have anger, and that was all just this dumb secular counseling stuff. I want biblical counseling, and yada yada yada. So what do you want me to do? How can I help you? You got to help me get my wife back. Yeah. So now, do I blame him for wanting him to have his wife back? Not at all. Is that a bad goal? No. It's an insufficient goal. It's not the right goal. Now, here's the thing. If I don't help him get his wife back, what is he going to think of the counseling? Mm-hmm. In fact, remember what I said? He had previous counseling? It was all lousy because of what? Mm-hmm. To get his wife back. Now, although it was secular counseling, as I gathered more data as the sessions progressed, I understood that, even though it was secular counseling, it wasn't too far off from the things that I would have challenged him with either. Kind of goes back to what you guys were saying, that he wasn't listening to the counsel anyway. And that's why this is important to get expectations. Now, I didn't correct him right away. I said, that's a terrible goal. That's an insufficient goal. Of course not. I wanted him to come to a point where he saw that his goal was insufficient. And so some of my questioning then was, so how do you think that can happen? How do you think you can get your wife back? What are some things that perhaps we need to work through to hopefully for that to happen? So we start asking questions. Agenda. What are some other agendas that counselees might have that might be revealed? What are some other agendas? Some of the insufficient agendas. You can't blame them, and they're not bad.
Just cheating behavior. There's a lot of time with the topic of divorce. A lot of times the children who go through that might feel they're at fault.
They're what?
Might feel like they're at fault.
Mm-hmm.
Might feel like they're the problem. So it's trying to help them realize
Well, what we're considering is what are some of the other agendas that may distract from maybe the more biblical goals. Here's an agenda sometimes. Just take it away. Help. I just want relief from the pain. Now, can you blame somebody for that? No. Not at all. When you talked about the sin struggle, can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Just behavior change or behavior modification, like as long as I'm not doing this, I'm not, as long as I'm not looking at this, then I'm fine.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly in our culture today and in my culture, my days, I mean, an issue for men has a lot, the pornography. It's a growing issue for women too, by the way. So a guy comes to you desperate. I got to overcome this. I just can't stand this anymore. Because of the guilt, because of the shame, because here's one reason. I remember one guy telling me, and I appreciate what he was saying. He said, I want to get married one day and I can't bring this into my marriage. I mean, that's good. That's good. He's seeing the consequences of what that's like. So help me overcome it so that I can be married one day. That's not a bad goal. And I don't want to discourage him, but it is short-sighted. Because what happens is, as soon as a young lady starts showing attention, they get serious, they do get married, or they get engaged, the motivation to change has also changed. I got what I want, I guess I can still deal with this. I'm still struggling with it, but I got what I want. That's the thing we have to be careful of in agendas and in goals. It's not a bad thing to want that. And that doesn't mean he shouldn't continue in that relationship. But the problem is, if a person brings a struggle like that, and yes, thank God he recognizes how devastating that can be to a marriage, but we got to get him pursuing a higher motivation. Eventually. So that data gathering, just in that question, can sometimes reveal a whole lot about the expectation of the counseling. So, yeah. All right. Now, the other element of this, and we're going to be taking another session. I think it's next week. The next session is on listening. As you're gathering data, you want to be listening. So that's the second critical skill of a biblical counselor, is to ask good questions and to be a good listener. So what are you listening for? We'll talk about that next time. Well, let's talk about asking good questions. Two kinds of questions that we ask. Extensive questions and intensive questions. You can look at it this way. Get my little chart there. Extensive questions are asking questions in a broad area. Okay, this is the background issues. Intensive questions focus more specifically on the issue and how it impacts their life. Okay, that's the difference between the two. Extensive questions. For example, this is something I go over with the interns, and this is, when we review and talk about things. And I'm coaching them in their counseling. This is the information I want to know in order to be able to help them, coach them in their counseling. These are the background issues. This is the broad end of the funnel. Physical issues, resource issues or relationships, emotions, actions, concepts, and historical. Let me break that down a little bit further. What do I mean by physical? See, if you were, notice here, I'm giving you different key hooks of things to memorize to help you when you're in the middle of something. All right, so we talked about, the broad view of counseling is data gathering, interpretation, and then application. And then we talked about the core data. What's the problem? What have you done about the problem? How can I help you with the problem? Now, when we're getting more specific in data gathering, if you can memorize this acrostic, these are the key areas of data gathering we want to focus on in getting the broad picture of what's going on in a person's life. Physical, their health, their fitness, sleep patterns, substance abuse, chronic illness, any medication that they're on. Now, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not gonna talk about the morality or the publicity of medicine. And again, there's that idea that, especially when it comes to, the mental health perspective, I have to be very careful not to give advice that I'm not qualified to give because I'm not a medical doctor. Or not to make somebody feel guilty or less spiritual because they're taking some kind of medicine. Yet, why do I ask that question then? Because I know certain medicine has certain side effects. How do I know that? I'm not a doctor. I'll ask the counselee. Now, do you suffer any kind of side effects from the medicine that you're on? Now, it may not have anything to do with mental health. I'm on cardiac medicine. I'm a cardiac patient. And can that affect your moods? I mean, I can watch a movie and start getting teary-eyed because there's some aspect, and that was never part of my personality. But ever since I started taking heart medicine, does this stuff, does it impact your moods? Yes. So that may be important to know. Certainly the health and fitness and the sleep. If you're dealing with people with anxiety, and it's not chronic anxiety, but acute anxiety. Chronic anxiety means it seems like it's a part of their life. Chronic illness. I have chronic illness, it's called heart disease. I had triple bypass, that's chronic. Acute means, an acute illness is like getting a cold. Sometimes people have acute anxiety, meaning it's an episode that they're going through, and oftentimes that can be related to sleep. Or it's complicated by not getting enough sleep. Like an anxious person is up a lot because they're anxious, they can't get to sleep, so it makes their anxiety even worse. It's a vicious circle they get caught in. So sometimes a doctor may prescribe sleep medication so they can get some sleep, so their body can get the rest, and then it can operate physically, better. That's why that's important. I remember just a couple years ago talking to a student, you guys will appreciate this, talking to a student at the beginning of February about their anxiety. And it was bad. I mean, it was really bad because it just totally knocked them out. What I mean by knocked them out is it just totally withdrew from everything. They couldn't do anything. And they were terrified. And it was pretty, and the roommates and the RA and the DC all came in together. Great support team. It was great. That's the way it should be. They came in, and so I'm doing all the data gathering, and I find out she hasn't been sleeping. What goes on in February at Word of Life?
Snow and
Exactly. And she had been assigned some assignments. She had counseled 2 weeks in a row.
Oh.
She had gotten sick. Well, yeah, you know, okay. And up late studying because she was cramming.
Right.
Stuff like that. And it was the perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we're talking and the roommates and the RA and the DC all had a different perspective too that they offered. And she invited them all in, by the way, which I thought was great. So what I did was I called the deans and I said, could we just give this young lady the whole weekend off? Because this is like a Thursday that she had come in. She hadn't been in class all week. 'Cause at that point. So I said, could we just give her this weekend off? And I said, just sleep in every day. You know, don't even worry about schoolwork. We'll get extensions on your schoolwork. And again, I didn't know. One of the things I knew was she wasn't getting sleep. Was this going to be more than sleep? You know, could have been. The issue could have been more than just getting sleep. Obviously, that doesn't always cure things. But that at least, what happened was she finally got to a place where she could actually think. Because anytime she had a fearful thought, it would just take off. She couldn't control it. Why? Because she was just too tired. Have you ever been that tired? Where your mind just kind of, it's like, well, where'd that come, you know? But imagine dealing with fear. And so sleep was an important part of that. And she was able to at least begin to work through things. And I only had to meet a couple of times more with her. And then she plugged into the resources God gave her in her room and all of that because it was a positive thing there. So, which brings another question, resources. What kind of resources does a person have? This young lady had good friends. Now, were they experienced biblical counselors? No. But they loved her, and they cared about her, and they supported her, and they provided. That was a good thing. Some people don't have that. And that makes the situation a lot more challenging. To know what kind of resources they have, relationships they have, can be very helpful in how you help them. Part of the problem is, some of the situations that they deal with, part of somebody's struggle with anxiety or depression sometimes is related to the fact that their family is so dysfunctional. Part of your counseling involves helping them deal with their dysfunctional family. They don't have the tools or the resources to know how to deal with that. Because we can pump them up with positive promises of the Bible, but we still have to teach them how to live in a difficult environment. You see, part of biblical counseling isn't just telling somebody, okay, yes, we focus on their identity in Christ. That's really important. That's very critical, who they are in Christ. Because that's going to impact how a person responds, yes. And a lot of times they get that, but they don't know how to live that out in a very dysfunctional family situation. And that's why that kind of data is important. So I just don't want to know if they're married or if they're dating or anything like that. I want to know about how that impacts their life. Is that a potential resource? Or is that a potential issue that's going to require maybe some help in how to live in that situation? Emotions. What are the typical emotions that are part of their life? What emotions do they experience? Actions. Responses is what we're talking about here. Habit patterns. That question, what have you done about it? That sometimes the answer you get is how they respond to a problem. I want to get data in how they deal with it. So somebody who is under like a stressful situation. When I was pastoring, there were a number of police officers, correctional officers in our church, and in the community for that matter. And I counseled a number of them. And one of the questions that I asked them, because I have a nephew who is on the force and is on a CPD, Chicago Police Department, right in the middle of all the stuff that's been going on this summer. He's right on the front line. I mean, I saw him back in August, and he's telling me, they just stand there, and people yell in their face, spit in their face. They throw all kinds of vile things at them, hit them, punch them, and they just stand there. And that's their shift. They're on for 2 hours, then they're off, then they go back to that, back on the street, because he had some of that duty, the riot duty. I don't know what they officially call it, but when things... And I remember counseling officers, state troopers, local men and women, and all the stuff that they see day in and day out. The depravity, the depth of the depravity that they're confronted with every day. Children that have been beat up by their parents, all the vileness of, the sexual assaults and things like that, the way humanity treats one another. I mean, just how do you deal with that? And a lot of officers, and their response to that is they're looking for, places to escape that, to get out of that. There's a lot of camaraderie amongst officers because here's the thing, nobody understands what they're going through unless you're a fellow officer. You cannot imagine. That's why after their shift they go out and they drink. The camaraderie of fellow officers who understand what they're going through. The divorce rate among law enforcement is off the charts. It's like 75%. So, how they respond to things is important data. And you're saying, well, Joey, we're not going to be counseling police officers. Not yet. Not yet, but that's an example. Sometimes, for example, men who struggle with pornography. Pornography is not necessarily the primary problem. Pornography sometimes is at this level of the action. It's not necessarily the action. Obviously, that's a sinful action. It's trying to understand at this level. It's a response to something else. Pornography oftentimes is an escape. Because for some people, they create a world of their own. It's a response, or it becomes a response, it becomes an escape because of the stressors that they're dealing with in life. All right, guys, I'm trying to really put meaning to why this is important. Okay, that's why I'm going into this. We'll talk some more, so listen very carefully about their actions. Ask questions about their actions. Conceptual thinking. One of the concepts, obviously, is how do they think about God? Faith. Faith issues. maybe you've heard this quote before. I've heard others quote this as well. Tozer's quote of, what you think about God is the most important thing about you. And I think an application of that in counseling and for all of us is the aspect of how we see God shapes how we see the problem. I ask this question sometimes. How does your relationship with Jesus help you understand what's going on? How does your relationship to Jesus help you walk through what you're going through right now? And I ask this question. Do you have a dynamic relationship with Jesus? I like to use that word. The Greek word dynamic is dunamos, dynamite, or Romans 1, the power of the gospel. Do you have a dynamic relationship with Jesus? Or is this struggle diffusing that dynamic aspect? In other words, people talk about faith, but it's not very dynamic. It's not very powerful. It's just a culture that they're in. It's not a resource, a spiritual resource that they're actually plugged into. So that's why I want to understand the concept of God. I'm not trying to be judgmental. Believe me, because I got to every day make sure I'm plugged in. Or some of my struggles expose the fact that, you know what, I'm not seeing this as God sees it. You know, I'm trying to do this in my own flesh, not by the power of the Spirit. So that's gonna impact how I view life, my view of God, and my view of my relationship to God. By the way, a lot of people are going to be very honest. My experience is I don't have a dynamic relationship. That's the problem. And thanks for being so transparent. And again, it's that idea of the culture that we live in here, up here sometimes, is that's shameful. How can you be a BI student and not have a dynamic relationship with Jesus? What's wrong with you? And that's what some people might feel. So again, concepts, then the historical data, family background, obviously, past hurts, traumatic experiences. You know, the past, our interest in understanding the past is to the degree of how it impacts the present. Remember what we said our first session. These issues are shaping influences, but they're not what? Determinative. They don't determine what we become, but they definitely shape how we think and how we process. Sometimes dealing with, I worked in student life for a good chunk of time too, dealing with conflicts in rooms and conflicts between people, especially conflicts in rooms, different personalities. You know, some families, for example, yell at each other all the time. Now some people say, well, yeah, that's, people from a Latino background, they yell at each other all the time. It's funny how people do that. They make it an ethnic issue, but that's true of every ethnic group. I mean, why do I know it? Because I've heard people say that from every kind of ethnic background that I can imagine. Germans do that. So whatever. And maybe it may be a family kind of a thing. Some families, they just yell at each other all the time. And then other families, they're very quiet and they're gentle, and then you get those two people in the room talking with two other varieties as well of personality and everything. And the person's always yelling and they're thinking, that person hates them. You get a couple, you're counseling a couple. And by the way, you could be giving advice to a friend who's in a relationship, and the one person is comes from a background of family would scream at each other, and that's the way they talk about problems. Their problem solving is somebody's yelling. And they're thinking, this is terrible. Now, by the way, probably the yelling is something that they do need to tone down. It's not helpful. But what happened is that's what they grew up with. They never saw that as being wrong, because the family did love each other. They just screamed at each other all the time. And it had nothing to do with whether or not they loved each other. But wow, if you're not used to that, now that causes conflict, especially in a marriage relationship, because one is yelling and the other's not. And see that again, it's a shaping influence, but it's not determinative. All right. Now, and you can get this. You don't have to write this. Now, what I've done is I've taken the topic of anxiety, because this is from another class, and what I've done here for you, and you can get this off the PowerPoint, off the Canvas, is I've laid out all the questions for the topic of anxiety. Not all of the questions, but a lot of the questions that I might ask under each one of those areas of our acrostic. These are some of the questions that I would ask. If you want to get these, you can just download it off the Canvas, okay? It's on the PowerPoint. Or did I put them in your notes?
I think you sent them as a separate document on Canvas.
Okay. All right. So you'll have them there. So again, I'm giving you some of the questions that, I might ask when a person's struggling with anxiety. So remember, we talked about sleep before, nightmares. That's sometimes that accompanies people dealing with anxiety. Has there been any changes to your appetite? Eating patterns is another area. If there's a big change, all of a sudden they gain a bunch of weight or lose a lot of weight. That's important to know. Do you suffer from any other chronic illnesses? Have you experienced palpitations or rapid heartbeat? Obviously, is there panic attacks associated with their anxiety? That's where we're going with that. Are you on any medication? So those might be some of the physical things I might ask for somebody who presents their problem, saying, hey, I'm struggling with anxiety. Relationships. How would you rate your relationship with your wife and kids and family, boss, coworkers, whatever the primary relationships are? Your roommates, that kind of a thing. That can be a source of stress, which can be, obviously feed the anxiety issues. Who is the most difficult person you have to deal with in your life? That's a stressor, right? And again, I ask that because part of the counseling ultimately may involve you teaching them how to deal with that person. Because part of the issue is, I don't know how to deal with this guy. Oh, there he is, and it triggers those thoughts. And so compassion isn't just, and again, just dealing with the physical issues that might be behind that, but also teaching them how to live. Are you actively involved in a church? That's a question I ask. And I'm not suggesting that if you start going to church, all your problems are going to be fixed. No. But we need to be under the instruction of the Word. We need to be plugging into the one another resources of the body of Christ. That's an important element that I want to connect them to. That's a long-term thing, so that when counseling is done, they're plugged into the godly resources that are around them to help them continue to grow. Who are your closest friends? How have they been involved in your life? Are these positive influencers? Are they negative? those are some of the things we're going to want to deal with as well. So again, the emotions, how do I ask some of those questions? What emotions typically characterize your life? Why do I want to bring this up with anxiety?
Where are you going?
Oh, sorry, guilt. Sorry about that. How often do you deal with guilt?
I think guilt can bring anxiety. It's a very big factor in why you're feeling anxious.
Yeah. You can feel guilty for feeling anxious.
Yeah.
It's a vicious circle sometimes.
And you can be anxious for feeling guilty.
Yeah. Right. If we take a step further, sometimes people feel guilty about things they don't have to feel guilty about. You know, in other words, they've created some kind of standard that they're failing to keep, which God doesn't necessarily have that standard. Or it's an expectation of letting other people down. Depressed people often feel guilty about their depression because they're letting family down. And it just adds and intensifies the experience of depression. So yeah, guilt is a big deal. Oftentimes. Is there something which you especially feel guilty about? Again, I want to get objective with it, not just guilt can be very subjective. So I want to know, okay, so what is it? What is the object of your guilt? What is it that you feel guilty about? Where do you think you have failed? Who do you think you've let down? That kind of a thing. Some other things, because anxiety has a lot to do with loss or the fear of loss. In other words, anxiety is sometimes the projection of the future, the what ifs. What if this happens? What if that happens? I'm going to ask questions about what they fear they might lose, or what are some of their greatest fears. It's another way of asking that question. Actions. Have you stopped doing what you once enjoyed and now no longer find pleasurable? Maybe they were a gamer, and now they don't even like it anymore. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's a big change. All right. It is time to break until Friday. So we'll see you all on Friday.
My second legendary like a week or two ago.
I haven't even done it.
I haven't really, the plan, so.
Wow.
That's